Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming here bright and early, and thank you to our panelists. So this panel, called Finance in a New World, big, brave, bold topic. Finance in a new world, one that at the moment seems very uncertain, where we're having to re-question everything that we based our investment principles on over the last few decades, where there are new fragilities to think about, and where the sheer number of different overlapping crises and issues has made the answers to them much more complex, from COVID to accelerating climate change, to inequalities and biodiversity loss. The list goes on. So what's the role of finance in responding to these system-wide challenges? And how can the financial players navigate both returns and do so sustainably? Those are the core questions of today's panel. But before we tackle those, I'd like to ask the panelists to introduce themselves to get the panel warmed up a bit. I'll let you introduce yourselves in 1 minute each. So starting with Sarah Bourhim, who's Sustainable and Responsible Investment Officer at Mirabeau Asset Management. If you could tell us a little bit about yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone, and thank you for your presence today. Indeed, such a challenging topic, and that takes courage and boldness and sightfulness to address. I'm Sarah Bourhim. I work as part of the Sustainable and Responsible Investment team at Mirabeau Asset Management, the asset management business line of Mirabeau Group, a 200 years financial institution that's been working with sustainability in its DNA. Before joining Mirabeau, I have navigated the space of sustainability and finance from both the portfolio management side, the research, the consultancy, as well as the issuer sides, which helped me have an interesting view before joining the asset management to work with companies and other stakeholders to ensure that we are on the right path to achieving the global sustainability agenda. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And now turning to Daniel Weil, Chief Sustainability Officer at J. Safra Sarasin. If you could tell us a little bit about yourself as well. You've had a bit of a pivot as well in your career, which...
Thanks a lot, Casimira. Absolutely, it's a pleasure to be here. It's great to have the opportunity to talk about such an important topic. Originally, I'm actually a water engineer. I worked a lot also in development cooperation, environmental technology, but then realized during my career that it takes more than just the technology. It takes regulation and it takes financing. So more and more, I entered the financial field, worked for Sustainable Asset Manager for 13 years, then also for a big bank for 2.5 years, and now finally for J. Safra Sarasin. I think the specialty of J. Safra Sarasin is that we are family owned, which is great to be in the sustainability field, because by definition it means we are thinking in generations, we are thinking long term, and in other words, I would say that's called sustainability.
Thank you, and last but not least, Jonathan Duncan, CEO of Asteria Investment Managers.
Thanks very much. So yeah, I'm currently the CEO of Asteria Asset Management. We're a dedicated impact investing boutique with both liquid and illiquid capabilities in developed and emerging markets. We're a 2.5-year-old startup and trying to really pioneer a data-driven, evidence-based style of investing. Just by way of personal background, you can probably hear I'm South African by birth. I'm also an engineer by training. Did a master's degree in environmental science and worked as a sustainability kind of consultant with mining engineering firms and many direct production firms based out of Cape Town, South Africa for about 20 years. I was a partner at ERM. About a decade ago, I joined one of my biggest clients, who's a 175-year-old, 100 billion multi-generational pension fund, and really pioneered and set up their sustainable investing practice, working right across, equities, fixed income, private equity, and really working with those teams to help them understand a long-term systemic shift. I guess the benefits of the firm that I was in, multi-decadal liability horizon. We were both an asset owner and an asset manager under one roof. And so we were really able to pioneer thinking and practice in this space. And so it's a real pleasure to be now based in Switzerland and working in a firm that's really kind of pioneering this kind of work on a global scale. So thank you.
So we heard on the first day in Patrick Audier's opening remarks, he said that the war in Ukraine has given a whole new meaning to the environmental transition. So my first question to each of you is to briefly give a tangible example of how you're seeing these challenges, like the war, impact your line of work from a sustainability standpoint. So perhaps starting furthest from me, Jonathan, if you want to take that one.
Yeah, sure. Without sort of getting into too much detail around sort of the war in Ukraine itself, I guess it's definitely sharpened attention on energy, the geopolitics of energy. But without sort of, I'm going to take a slightly different tack. I don't really want to speak too much about sort of energy and climate. I think it's really been well covered. What I'm really interested in terms of, systemic shifts and what this current moment means for the industry we're in is really this past summer to me, particularly sort of what I've seen in Europe is a growing level of skepticism and disbelief and concern around the sustainable ESG impact investing space. I speak to people out in the market and their eyes just roll. They're like, oh no, not this story again, And as a consequence, I think there's a lot of concern, and perhaps rightfully so, around greenwashing risk, and there's a lot of concern around, well, does this topic even matter? Is it really the space for finance professionals to be solving for this issue? And so the risk and the concern that I have is that the investment professional goes cold on this topic and turns its attention away from it. And I see it both at the institutional client level. I see it both at the private investment advisory level. I even see it at a client level. And the issue is that people forget about the fact that actually we're in a massive systemic shift. There are biodiversity and climate-related issues. There are social systemic issues that are really gathering pace. I don't know if any of you have recently read the report that came out from Exeter University looking at tipping points. They talk about the tipping points that are arriving sort of within the 1.5 to 2 degree bound that we're heading towards from a temperature increase perspective. We're talking about these tipping points being reached in the very near term. We're talking about things like the western Antarctic ice shelf completely collapsing, the arrival of summer permafrost, the rapid decline of coral reefs, and these tipping points create real systemic risk in the here and now. And so my concern is that we are in a world from a societal perspective where there's a big question mark over, is this an industry that really should be worrying about the sustainability topic? Or as we heard from BlackRock yesterday or the day before, actually this is just an issue for governments to solve. We need more regulation. So I guess, aside from the sort of biodiversity, systemic risk issues and the challenges it creates, my real concern is managing the war for ideas with our clients, with the regulators, with the advisory folk that we interface with on this topic. And so what does it mean for us in the here and now? It means being radically focused on data-driven, evidence-based, deep thinking about the economic shift that is underway. Being able to evidence very clearly to our clients which sectors, which regions, which asset classes are going to be in structural decline, which ones are going to be enjoying a tailwind. And so, maybe just to land here is to say that there's a lot of noise in the system. We believe the sustainability trend is a long run through the cycle, systemic shift, which we need to be focused on. But in order to kind of really land it with clients, we need to be data-driven and evidence-based. And I think, what it's doing for us is it's making us double down on our efforts around that, really kind of hunting far and wide for the data points that evidence that actually this transition is underway. Leave it there, thank you.
Thanks very much. Sarah, do any of these concerns, this growing skepticism, among others, resonate with you?
Absolutely. I think from our point of view, the energy crisis and also the crisis on the geopolitical point of view has entailed so many implications, either directly or indirectly, on different sectors. So I hear that there is a moral hazard between the short-term and the long-term priorities, which might explain the skepticism sometimes, and also the cognitive biases that we have to prioritize the current time and the urgent needs. However, I strongly believe that the current crisis might serve as a detour, but not necessarily as a fork in the road in achieving the global sustainability agenda. But to do so, again, we need a data-driven approach. We need the ESG analysis and the fact of integrating sustainability in every investment decision to be in the most sophisticated way, to evolve in order to take into consideration the challenges of today, but also the needs of tomorrow. I believe, finally, that for the climate change, if it has shown anything, it is that the climate change, also the over-reliance and dependency on fossil fuels, can itself lead to conflicts, either inter or intra-countries, over the lack of resources, the scarce water, food security, as well as energy security. So I strongly believe that it should be taken as an opportunity to fasten up the race to ensure the independency from an energy point of view, but also the achievement of the global sustainability agenda.
Thank you, and we'll talk about some of the responses and solutions in a second, but just to hand over to Daniel, what do you think are some of the biggest dangers regarding the situation that we're in?
Yeah, it's obviously a critical moment in sustainable investing, but I think it's even more than a detour. Maybe it's also a teaching moment, which forces us to be not only very firm in our beliefs, but also a bit self-critical, and maybe test some of our assumptions we had in the past. Test some of our values. Doesn't mean we have to change them, but maybe we find the right rationale again. And I don't have to mention them, I'm sure they're all very present. It's about energy and where we want to go. It's about personal values, even like weapons and armament, which we discuss also with our clients. What does that mean in the current situation? For me, before the crisis, we were maybe almost a bit too comfortable. Sustainable investing just went up, growth rate 30% or more every year, which is fantastic, but it just worked. The oil price was low, so you didn't have to really make a claim to be climate conscious and give up performance and things like that. So now is the moment where we can think about all of that. You mentioned data and evidence, which is extremely important. But the biggest risk I actually see in the fact that we might jump to short-term solutions because of short-term problems and lose perspective on the long-term solutions which we really need. That can happen also because a crisis is often abused by different parties to just promote their own idea. And the most obvious one for me is that we have an energy gap now, not only in Europe, but also in Switzerland. And now we hear many voices, of course, we need nuclear power. Maybe yes or no, I don't want to make a judgment here, but we can definitely not get nuclear power for the energy gap this winter. The lead times for a new nuclear power plant is about 15 to 20 years. So maybe it's a good moment to talk about nuclear power, but we talk about 2042. And you may come to very different conclusions if that's then the energy source we really want to have at that point in time, or if the current teaching moment is not a great opportunity to use the extra profit from oil and gas to have more decentralized systems, to have stronger power grids, and so on. So I hope with data, with evidence, and with people who can think rationally, we are able to have these sound discussions and conversations with a perspective of the 2030s, 2040s, rather than overreact to the current crisis.
Daniel, maybe I stay with you there because you mentioned some solutions there, better data, transparency. I was going to ask you how the finance sector can respond to some of these challenges. So how can we redirect capital to where it's most needed? What are the delivery channels? Can you tell us a little bit more, give us some more specific examples?
Well, I believe it starts with transparency, right? We are maybe the ones which can make projections, we can make scenario analysis and show in a very honest way what also under certain probabilities, certain outcomes might be from a sustainability, but also from an impact perspective. And we can use these materials, these insights and outcomes to have valuable discussions among ourselves, with our staff, but then particularly also with our clients. We can educate ourselves, we can educate our clients, and then come to the point where we can match clients' preferences and expectations with hopefully innovative products that are innovative not just in a sustainable way, creating impact, but also in a financial way. Because let's face it, most of our clients also would like to see attractive returns. So if we are able to create vehicles, innovation, investment solutions that combine both, we can also convince our clients to go with us in that direction. And it's absolutely possible to do that with a long-term perspective. If we have good arguments, if we have good data, we can also trust that our clients will stay with us through a current crisis.
I've heard this a lot this week already, these having more innovative products. Can we have some case studies, some examples of the kind of products we're talking about? Sarah, could you give us an example?
Yes, definitely. So basically, first of all, I totally align with the point of view that transparency and the joint efforts are needed. For the products and the innovation, also for the financial point of view, there are many ways to address it. Are we talking about the listed asset space or about the private assets? There is also the products for developed countries as well as products that are needed to be developed to meet the needs of the developing countries, such as blended finance, project finance, as well as leveraging the potential of microfinance, for instance, and be able to scale it to achieve impact while sustaining the financial returns. From the listed assets perspective, we also have products that are looking at the climate solutions and be able to identify the companies that are meeting the needs of today and tomorrow by their products, by their services, and are also taking their impact on the environment and the society alongside the impact of the environment on their business. There are also mixed products such as the green bonds, the sustainability-linked bonds that have been developing in the last years that give the insurance that capital is directly floated to where it's needed to be by financing projects, direct projects linked to taxonomy-based projects, as well as energy, land, biodiversity, water. And again, I would like to stress that when we're talking about the climate change and the sustainability, we should have the global perspective that it's not just about the energy and the climate change, as you've highlighted, but it's also about the food security, about the health, about the education, and the global systemic shift that is needed to be achieved, the global society perspective to get where we need to be.
John, you mentioned to me before you've had a lot of experience working in emerging markets. How could we redirect more capital to where we really need this capital to go to different emerging markets and create environments that are also stable enough to attract funding from investors on a much bigger scale than we are today?
Yeah, thanks. Well, first of all, let me just start by saying, when we say the word finance, on the one side we mean capital. So, the golden rule, he or she who has the gold makes the rules. And so, there's the capital side of it, but then there's also the stakeholders, so the asset owners, the asset consultants, the asset managers. So when we talk about finance, as a collective, we're talking about multiple stakeholders. And I think the one sort of innovation or thing we need in order to support the direction of capital into those parts of the economy where it's most needed is really a refocus around a sense of purpose. What is the purpose of capital and the purpose of finance and the industry itself? And so it's a bit of a kind of challenge to the industry at a professional level. It's interesting to see the work that the CFA Institute, if you haven't read their report, The Power of FI, it's a report looking at the importance of purpose within the finance industry. I know the UK government at one point even considered the development of a code of ethics around sustainability in the world of finance. The UNPRI, for example, has written a great deal around what it means to be a fiduciary in the 21st century. And so I think a renewed sense of focus and purpose right across the financial sector is necessary in order to get capital in the first instance to the places that it's needed. And I know we're going to speak a little bit more about sort of that, personal values and ethics and what that means a little bit later. So, putting on an emerging markets hat, I think what's interesting is there was a great report released this week by the looking at the role of climate and national debt. Pre-COVID, 45% of least developed and emerging market economies were in a world of debt distress. Post-COVID, that number is closer to 60%. And we're currently entering into a world of, increased commodity pricing, and I'm quite sure the debt distress in those economies is going to be only more stretched. So certainly what we need is more, capital flowing into the emerging market economies. The reality is that most private wealth and capital that's saved up in emerging markets comes north. And there's a very small trickle of capital that is allocated south. And so when I think about the challenges that are necessary in emerging markets, it's important for emerging market economies to be able to show that they have the right levels of governance, that the solutions that are going to be developed are technically sound, and that capital can ultimately be returned. And having worked in this environment for the last decade in emerging markets, we had over $2 billion directed into long-term affordable housing, sustainable agriculture, renewable energy. And so it is doable, it is visible, it's possible to get there. Transport myself to this current moment being here in Europe, engaging with large-scale institutional clients, whether they are Swiss-based pension funds or private allocators of capital. Firstly, emerging markets, a lot of the real opportunities to deliver sustainable growth, you're not going to access it through liquid investments. The size of the liquid investment market in emerging markets, it's small. The bulk of our real on-the-ground impact in terms of solving for long-term social and environmental systemic risk is going to come from illiquid, long-dated investments. And when you go and you look at the current allocations in the first instance to private markets allocations in Europe, and just taking my experience in Switzerland to start with, it's low to begin with, which means that a lot of capital is chasing liquid strategies, focusing on quarterly returns. So that's definitely not going to solve, the emerging, the need in emerging markets. So I think on one level, there is an important role for emerging market, asset managers and allocators of capital to make their products, more visible in this market. But on the same side, there's also a need, for the consultants and those advising the allocation of capital to start thinking a little bit more long-term and to start looking at private markets in the first instance, to start thinking about the allocation between private debt and private equity, and then to start thinking really specifically around emerging market allocations. And there, I think, we're talking about data, we're talking about a change in the way finance is working. One of the things that this present moment brings into focus is that we're transitioning from this old school risk and return paradigm where you headed northeast towards the efficient frontier on that two-dimensional surface. If you add impact as a third leg into that world, we're now trying to triangulate for risk, return, and impact. And it means that there's a whole new series of vectors for capital to flow. And certainly emerging markets, if you add impact as a motivator for enhancing capital flows, you really get this accelerated impact add, if you like, from allocations to emerging markets. So, there's probably a lot more I could say, but I'm going to pause there and maybe my colleagues would like to comment or add to that.
Daniel, I saw you nodding away. Did you have something you wanted to add to John's comments?
No, I'm thinking a little bit about the different stakeholders that are involved in these transactions in a framework which makes it solid and comfortable for investors to also have exposure. And often we are asking ourselves, right, what is the role of the financial sector? Are we more pulling or pushing or following? And I believe in an ideal world, of course, all these stakeholders would work together. So policymakers would create a policy that internalize external costs and create the transparency needed for a fair market. We would have the civil society and the population voting at the ballot, but also through their wallets. We would have the industry developing innovative products and solutions, and then the financial sector, of course, we would be the ones financing these solutions. Now, in reality, the timing of these initiatives is not always completely aligned, and it can indeed also be risky then to be first and go somewhere if the others are not following. It could lead to a misallocation of capital at the end of the day. So on top of that, and I'm fully with you, I think it's also very important to have this dialogue between the different stakeholders and make sure that we basically act hand in hand, because that will give us the visibility and accountability that long-term investments, particularly then in the private space, are also safe to a certain degree.
Sarah, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, thank you. I totally echoes with everything we believe in, and I think that maybe something also for the innovation and what is needed in finance is that to take into consideration the heterogeneity aspects of the society, and not to address the South and the North, or even at the country level, and in the same way, but to take into consideration the social norms, the needs of each country, as well as the development pace of each country. So I think we really need to define the purpose, but also to identify clearly the needs for each part of the world, and finally to have actionable agendas that are put into perspective by both the private and the public sector hand in hand.
Can I maybe just add, sort of, your original question was around sort of specific examples of products or services or innovations that are coming forward. I mean, I guess, speaking specifically from my own perspective within the context of Asteria Asset Managers, we have a partnership with Ovium. Ovium has been directing capital into emerging markets from a private markets perspective, notably with support from the Swiss government over the last decade. At the same time, we've also been able to partner with a number of small foundations and families to start actually directing greater levels of private capital into emerging market fund of funds. And it's hard work, but the returns are there and the impact is certainly there. And so finding ways to scale, private market participation other than just in microfinance in emerging markets is certainly a challenge. And I think you're going to start seeing a greater level of emergence of on-the-ground asset managers who've got the capability to deliver that. Blended finance is an important innovation. It brings into scope the participation of government and multilateral agencies, and I think we can expect further innovations in that environment. But what's central in this discussion is, I guess, a shift towards longer-term allocations that are illiquid. And yeah, I'm curious to see how the strategic asset allocation frameworks that are adopted by asset consultants start to shift. I think the sort of traditional 60-40 split, we're in a moment where that's being tested.
And we had another example yesterday at a Gender Lens investment panel of Onyx Capital, so talking about a new fund of funds to direct capital into Africa from private markets. So another example from different panels this week. I wanted to pick up, since we're talking about some of the responses to challenges that you'd identified at the beginning of this panel. John, you talked about this growing level of skepticism and this war of ideas, and that's perhaps less tangible to respond to than talking about products. But how do we overcome that sentiment at the moment and align, respond to some of the backlash that we've seen to sustainable investing?
Yeah, I guess we're talking about the sort of intersect here between values and value, and how do we kind of embrace these two notions in the world of sustainable finance? I think it's kind of, I always try to remind my colleagues, it's important to recognize that the world of sustainability is both the field of complex system science, the interaction between biodiversity, the social system and the market system, and the world of externalities, and all the technical stuff that goes into policy making to try and support the redirection of capital. So, the world of complex system science, and it interfaces very directly with the world of ethical norms and behavior. And it's important that we learn to live with this kind of duality. What's interesting for me is that the finance sector, I think, has always traditionally screened out sort of, or steered away from any kind of emotion. Historically, there's sort of been little appetite for too much exuberance or too much fear, and so the industry has traditionally guarded against kind of the feeling sciences, if you like. But at the same time, I also remind my colleagues that what is an investment? It's an investment is nothing more than an expression of a belief around how you think the future is going to be. So it's both art and science, and so the belief side of it, the softer side, this purpose-driven, this professionalism around, what do we stand in, what do we believe, as professionals, is it important that we consider human rights, child labor, long-term social systemic risk, impact to, biodiversity. I think from a professional perspective, reinvigorating a focus on that is really important. I'm not sure that's going to be the thing that will solve for the current kind of noise around greenwashing, which, as Daniel indicated, is an important moment. I think deflating a bit of the hubris around this space is important, and we should be self-reflective on that. But I guess greenwashing, it says more about the innate nature of the market to sell things that are sexy and shiny than it does necessarily about the real systemic risk we all collectively face, all the intentions of sustainable investment professionals. So, I think, just to answer your question directly, this current moment, how do we solve it? I think staying the course, deepening our conviction, being evidence-based, recommitting from a professional values perspective, and really not forgetting that at the end of the day, we are investment professionals, and we need to deliver an appropriate risk-adjusted return, and show that we can both preserve capital and support its growth. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Sarah, is it possible to deliver this risk-adjusted return while also ensuring that investment decisions also safeguard the future of our planet? And we've had a lot of talk this week about fiduciary duty and responsibility. So what does it mean to act in the best interest of clients?
I think that to act in the best interest of the clients is to take the most informed investment decision. And it's by investing sustainably and responsibly and integrating the sustainability at all the stages of investment decisions, we are acting in the interest of our clients. As you've highlighted, doing good and integrating sustainability goes beyond just being a good citizen or promoting good practices amongst the companies we invest in. It's also about risk adjustments taken into considerations, how companies are managing the material risks and opportunities related to their business models, how they are prepared for the challenges, and how they are managing the risks under the uncertainty that comes with the challenges that we are faced with. I think also a good approach that we have and a good way to approach it is really the active ownership, is by investing actively, by working hand in hand with the companies that we invest in order to help them walk the talk and to be prepared for all the challenges they might face, and also take into consideration the sustainability for their operations, but also their impact on the environment and the society.
Daniel, earlier you talked about this being a time to rethink our values. Can we talk about the financial industry having values, and what are these?
Well, I guess we all have differing values to some degree, right? And that also plays a role when we talk to clients, because we have to accept clients have different preferences, they have different values, they have different boundary conditions, and maybe different risk appetites. And that's absolutely fine. So our value should be to meet the client's interest in the best possible way. And in my experience, it helps, again, maybe going one step back and trying to be clear about own motivations. And usually that works quite well along the 3 lines of values and ethics, which usually leads to exclusions. Performance considerations are not so important in that context, because I don't want to invest in slavery even if I have a great return. I just don't want to. And most of our clients have such values, so it's important to clarify those. The second part, which we discuss with our clients, is how important is the financial materiality, as you pointed out, in investment decisions. In the sense of fiduciary duty, we almost have to do it, because we promise that we take care of all material factors in investment decisions. So maybe it takes a little bit of education, but that's usually not a big problem because it's so obvious. It becomes more and more obvious. And then is the third pillar, which is impact. And some clients may want that component as like the additional frontier you mentioned, and some others may not, or are not allowed to, which is also fine. If we clarify this with our clients, and at the same time also very clearly define what a specific investment strategy or investment product offers, we can match the two. And I think this is our responsibility, to match the client's preferences with the right investment strategies and products. And of course we can influence that by education, by evidence, by data, by proof of concepts, and so on. So a lot ahead of us to do, but it also means that we have to move away from a simplistic approach to sustainability and say this is sustainable and this is not, and this is A and this is a B, and move to a system where we say that's what it does.
Yeah, maybe I can build on that. I mean, having been in the sustainability field for the last sort of 20 plus years, what's interesting for me is that this, the sustainability spotlight sort of beginning in the early 90s started to focus on a number of the big consumer brands, and people were asking questions, where's this product made, in which factory, and by whom? And as a consequence of that sort of long arc of the sustainability field, that spotlight is now on the finance sector. And it's entirely possible for a client to say, what's in my portfolio? And clients should ask those questions, To what extent is my current portfolio aligned with a 2-degree world outcome? To what extent, does my portfolio have companies that have been involved in, major human rights, controversies in the past 6 months? How well have you voted at the AGMs of the companies in my portfolio? What kind of resolutions are you asking, are you supporting or not? And so it requires a different level of participation from the consumers of the financial products themselves. And I think that is in part underway. One of the sort of interesting things for me is that the real long-term investors, the ones that have these multi-decadal horizons, are really the pension funds. These are the big pools of capital out there that have got these long liability horizons and have the capacity to invest in the private market style assets, etc. But the inertia in some of those environments is big. So let me do this quick test here. Who's part of a pension fund here? okay, so not many people are involved in pension funds. That's interesting. But I'm guessing most of us as professionals have some kind of corporate pension fund backing. And the interesting thing with a pension fund is, so I go and speak to my pension provider and I say, look, I'm really interested around these long-term systemic risk issues. You know, can you tell me, you know, what's going on? And you know, often the response is, well, it's interesting, but you know, I didn't write the mandate. The mandate is written by an investment consultant. You should go and speak to the investment consultant. So I go and speak to the investment consultant, and of course the investment consultant says, well, you know, we wrote the mandate, but ultimately it was signed off by the trustees of the pension fund. You should go and speak to them. So I go and speak to the trustees of the pension fund, and they say, well, you know, we only really respond to the sort of whims and desires of the beneficiaries of the fund themselves. You should go and speak to them, which is of course me. So this kind of circle of blame thing exists, and it creates a hell of a lot of inertia in the industry itself. And you know, a good sort of factoid right now, 6% of Swiss pension funds, according to a study that was done last year, have got no long-term decarbonization strategy in place. And I wonder how many participants in the Swiss pension industry even know that or even are asking the question. So we're all part of the financial industry, and I guess on some level it does start with us. And so, yeah, I mean, hopefully it gives us a little bit of food to think about.
So there needs to be more responsibility at different levels and ownership for the issues at different levels of
Yeah, I would say so. I would say that there's the individuals, which are us, responding to the varying values and risk appetites and the liquidity constraints of our clients. But it does require action from all parts in the industry. I mean, we heard, some of you may have been in the session yesterday where Paul Polman was speaking with the ex-CEO of Danone, and it was very interesting to hear their view on sort of what's required in order to get the system to shift. And as ex-business leaders, their view is, look, the business case is clear. This leads to lower cost of capital, better levels of resource efficiency, stronger levels of staff engagement, better R&D, and ultimately stronger, longer, profit profiles. So as business leaders, that's what they're saying. So the business case, and from their perspective, is settled. But they came back to the values discussion at the end. I don't know if you heard Paul Polman say, he was just, look, the only way this thing gets solved is if there's a radical reshift in the way participants in the finance sector act professionally and personally, which it's quite a big ask to get 7.5 billion or 9 billion people on the planet to rethink their personal values around sustainability. So, I agree that we need sort of a shift in values, but it's no small shift we're talking about here.
So staying with this topic of values, and I wanted to talk about, without getting into the politics, because it's and staying broader, but we are living in an increasingly politicized world, and where it's become increasingly about picking sides, even for companies and finance industry. It's difficult to stay neutral on some topics. How can financial actors ensure that they're making the right decisions for their clients and not picking sides, as it were? And how do you know what the smartest thing to do is in the current environment? Perhaps, Daniel, would you like to answer that one?
Well, not easy, but look, I originally have a scientific background, so if the atmosphere is too heated and too emotional, then I usually go back to facts, figures, and evidence. And that's, I think, what's helped, because then you can differentiate between what do we know, what insights do we have, and that's already sometimes difficult to get agreement on which data is relevant and what the facts are, but that's already a lot. And then the interpretation and the conclusions out of these facts and figures, we have to accept that they may vary, because people have different backgrounds, different interests, different preferences. So neutral in the way you mentioned it, for me would be to stick to the facts, try to get agreement on which facts we accept as basis, and then talk in the best possible way about possibilities. And if we don't agree, what can help is work with scenarios, with probabilities, and what's the smartest solution then? What's the right thing to do for the client today is based on today's knowledge, take the decision which hopefully brings the solution the closest to the client's preferences. Always keeping in mind, we may have to revise this opinion when we have more data, when we learn something on addition. That's for me how science works, and hopefully taking that approach we can take a little bit of this tension away from the discussion.
Sarah, your thoughts on this?
Yes, for how we could approach also the challenges, it's really, as you've said, is to meet and to ensure that we have enough knowledge about the client's preferences, but also where we define the lines of where to divest, where to engage, and where is it okay to stay. For this, we need informed decision. We need clear data, evidence-based for the ESG analysis to be able to assess the company's exposure, the company's willingness to shift, as well as the company's potential involvement in controversial activities that we will need either to engage with them to review their positions or to divest from that. I strongly believe that considering that finance has evolved from the simple loans to the complex system with all what entails from the heterogeneity, the reaction, the bounded rationality, it is really needed today to integrate this complexity as well as this sophistication when we take into consideration the investment decision. It might not be the solution, but it can definitely help take the best decision and act in the smartest way and to optimize our portfolios.
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
I mean, the politics of science is a real thing. COVID has shown us that. Politics of tobacco health, politics of climate change. We're in that world right now. So, how do you make the best decisions for your clients? I think I completely agree with this idea that we need to be, fact-based and data-driven. And I think modeling and probabilities gives us a good view of what that can look like. Sometimes the facts are shocking. Yesterday I heard that there's a 300 gigaton carbon budget left to the world. We're sitting with an annual burn rate of about 40 to 50 gigatons, which effectively means we've got 6 to 7 years left before we smash through the 1.5 to 2 degree sort of climate target that everyone's. And even in the face of those facts, if a client's got pressing immediate commercial needs right now, from a finance perspective, often, often the facts don't necessarily support the best possible decision. So it is complex. I think from a modeling perspective, we are in a world of big data. There is some fantastic modeling capacity and skills out there. Second language in our business is Python. We are interested in sort of modeling different scenarios and outcomes. This idea that we don't have the data is not true. We've got good quality data, I would say, relative to where we were 5 years ago. We've got an increasing clear visibility on the physical implications of the decarbonization of the global economy. We are able to start getting better probabilistic sort of, views on what various kind of portfolios may look like in a world that maybe has runaway climate change or perhaps has a really radical policy response. So getting that visibility and starting to get clear in terms of where will the winners be, or the losers for that matter, at an asset class level, at a geographic level, at a sector level. And I think it allows us to start navigating towards where the best possible solution may lie. But anyone who's been in the markets will know that, you know, the markets can be irrational a lot longer than you can remain solvent. So it's tough to be an investor right now to allocate capital, and you know, getting the right solution. Yeah, it's not an easy thing to get to. And if anyone here has the answer, please speak with me afterwards.
Well, the next part was focused on implementing change. So that's a big ask when we're talking about the fact that it's difficult to find the right solutions right now. My questions to you was, well, before we get into that, I had a question. So one of you mentioned this earlier, but is finance a follower of change or a driver of change? And if we can talk about the regulatory aspect as well. Who would like to take that? So is finance destined to follow regulation, or can it make the first move? Who should move first?
Well, I can maybe follow up on what I said earlier on this, because I mentioned that the different stakeholders should move hand in hand, because it could be risky if one of them does it alone. As an example, if we financed low carbon technologies, even with our balance sheet, but nobody wants to buy the products, and the regulator fails to install the boundary conditions, a carbon tax, which internalizes external costs, then that will be a misallocation of capital. It can be dangerous for the firm, can be destabilizing for the financial sector. So yes, we can probably push a little bit, we can go a little bit ahead, but we should make sure that the others are following. Otherwise, we are not doing a good job in creating stable societies and economies. That means in parallel, we have to have some policy dialogues. We have to talk to the public, talk to the clients, so to make sure that we all move in that direction.
Do you both agree, Sarah?
Yeah, I think that finance has definitely the potential to be a driver of change when it's thinked and put in the right way. We have seen that today finance is needed to redirect the capital flows to finance the transition and the global sustainability agenda. But also with the complexity and the sophistication of the different products and the tailored products comes the risks of the lack of homogenization, as well as the diversions of terminologies and the lack of transparency, hence the need for a regulation. But I believe it should be a good regulation that it takes into consideration the need for involvement, to be agile and worked in a participative way with the different stakeholders, issuers, and investors in order to ensure consistency, evolution, and transparency.
And Jonathan, how can we set the right conditions and parameters so that finance can be an enabler and avoid the risks of over-regulating as well?
Yeah, look, I mean, no one in the finance sector is going to solve climate or social risk on their own. You know, no one in the finance sector is going to sort of solve the world's plastic issues. So definitely requires collaboration, and I think a healthy engagement with the policy-making machinery is necessary. I do worry that there may be this sort of overreaction from a policy perspective, which could end up kind of, you know, leaving us in a situation where there's no policy clarity, there's policies that are not necessarily fit for purpose, and end up tying up the industry in too much regulation. So, but having said that, I also believe that there is a role for policy to provide safeguards for the industry. And so I think about some of the work that's going on around the development of taxonomies, green economy taxonomies around the world as an important evolution that's happening. It's supporting, you know, helping, I guess, direct capital to, you know, growth paths that are low carbon, resource efficient, socially inclusive. So I think, you know, the industry has a role to play in certainly not necessarily leading that change, but being an enabler, being actively engaged, and making sure that what's put out there is fit for purpose. I think there's an area where the finance sector can lead, and I believe it can do so from the perspective of self-interest. And I think specifically around pushing for change around government subsidies, particularly in areas of fossil fuels or unsustainable agriculture. I mean, these are areas around the world that get massive amount of policy or enabled or government-supported capital. And there, I think it's in the interest of the finance sector to start leading and pushing innovation in terms of alternative ways of agriculture. When we've heard about the size of the investment opportunity in that space, and certainly the finance sector is able to, with depending on the risk appetite of the capital, whether it's venture or early stage or seed capital or venture philanthropy even, to start really leading the industry into new areas of growth. But at the same time, there is also a space for the industry to start pushing and being a lot more vocal around getting governments to stop supporting those parts of the economy that are actually dragging us backwards. So, finances are both an enabler, and I think we have a role to play both in terms of innovating and experimenting. We are in the business of taking on risk, and with the appropriate capital, we can manage that risk or support driving growth on that side. And on the other side, I think the big, long-dated capital has the opportunity to be, really a driver of change, particularly at the corporate level. I think, if you look at the size of the liquid markets globally, and you look at the size of the amount of capital that is invested in, the equities of listed companies, to have people that are absent landlords, i.e. they don't have any visibility of what's going on in those companies. What is the long-dated strategy? Does the executive reward structure reflect a strategy that actually is solving for, low carbon, resource efficient? There's no limit to the extent to which we in the industry can actually push the incumbents, for stronger and longer change.
Sarah, I see you have something to add.
Yeah, maybe I can add to this that in addition to what you've said, is finance really need to stay in the service of the real economy. For the transition, for instance, if I take the example of building portfolios that are aligned with 2 degrees, we can decarbonize a portfolio, but just underweighting the most carbon-intensive companies, the carbon-intensive sectors, but it will decarbonize the portfolio, but not the word. The real problem is staying there. So it really takes conviction, pragmatism, as well as to be bold and courageous to take the party of building portfolios that are not necessarily aligned today, that are not low carbon emitters, but also investing in transition bonds, investing in companies that show the willingness, in companies in the emerging markets that need the capital in order to shift their business models and to improve their practices. And for instance, this was really what we had in mind. We have launched a product focused on not only the green bonds, because we needed the green bonds to redirect the capital directly to projects, but also to invest in transition bonds that are mainly a bulk of the most carbon-intensive sectors and companies in transportation, in oil and gas, and energy, in automotive sector. And we believe that these sectors need to be worked with mainly through engagement. So we have built strong engagement frameworks. And the outcomes and the takeaways is that for some sectors, the finance is really crucial to work, but it needs to be throughout the whole value chain. For example, for airlines with the need for development of sustainable airlines fuels, or with the automotive where it starts even with the tires to the end of use of vehicles. So it's really complex value chains where the finance is needed and where really pragmatism and convictions to work hand in hand with the companies as well as the policymakers, the initiatives. During the week, we have heard a lot about the alliances. And I believe that the alliances are really a good place to join efforts with like-minded investors, to influence the companies in joint efforts, but also to help them walk the talk of the sustainability.
Are those convictions there, and how can we accelerate all this? It's a bit of a broad question, but as we're coming towards the end, I mean, ultimately, we've identified some of the big challenges. We've talked about some of the solutions and responses, but again, we've been asking these questions for several years, decades now, but the question is still relevant. How can we get more capital flowing in the right direction? We've talked about the perspective of time, how the future is now. We need to be addressing these challenges now. So how can we turbocharge all this?
It's a good observation, because we talked about it before, that many of the questions we discussed at this conference are sadly the same questions we discussed 15 years ago at these conferences. But nevertheless, we have learned in the meantime. And I would say one important factor is what we discussed before: clarify the motivations, and then move from there and not think that one size fits all. A second one is that, as important as data and facts are, we mentioned it several times today, we should also not hide behind, oh, we need more data, we are not absolutely sure. Let's face it, we know what we have to do. We have to decarbonize. We all know how important Scope 3 emissions are. We know how complicated it is to calculate, and there is no agreement. So we should not say, let's wait until we have a final system how to calculate Scope 3 emissions. We know we have to decarbonize, and I think it's clear for thermal coal by now, but it has to become clear over time also for oil and gas and others, in line with the projection of the International Energy Agency. So this pragmatism, you also pointed this out, I think will help moving forward. It needs a little bit of brave behavior to get there, but then we can do it. Also, I think we have not covered it today, the topic of rating agencies and kind of oversimplified ratings, A, B, C, and so on. I see a certain danger that, for instance, regulation relies too much on such systems, which do not really help us finding the right solutions. So my ambition is to look always behind the curtain, what is behind these ratings, because only there we find the information that can be matched with an actual investment strategy or with client preferences. So if we put all of this together, I think we have a good chance of speeding up things a little bit and driving capital in the right direction, but not for everybody in the same way.
So we've talked a lot about decarbonization, and that's only, climate is only one of the several issues that we also need finance to address, whether it's social inequalities and education, health. All these factors are all interlinked and problems that need to be addressed. Do you think this gets overlooked, and how can we bring all these different? Are we too siloed in our thinking about some of these different challenges that we face today, and how can we integrate them better? Sarah, I'm looking at you here.
I believe that it's not really overlooked as such, maybe, but today the discussion is really focused on the energy and the climate change because it came as an emergency. And if the energy crisis highlighted anything, it's really the need for independence, energy independence, and to shift quickly to a more reliable source of energy and the renewable energies. The second issue is, through the last years, we have realized that after all the climate crisis, we were thinking that it's tomorrow, but actually tomorrow is today, because we have had floods last year, we have had heat waves, and the global warming is really speeding up. So we are coming to the realization that it's time to act, not to reflect or to model or to think of what to do, but it's really to act. The second part is that the climate change as an issue in itself is very interrelated to social and governance issues. So by managing the climate risks, we are also taking into consideration the food security, ensuring less migrations in the south, also independence in the agriculture, diversification, and ensuring the stability of the societies over the long run. I believe that where the trade-off or maybe the ethical values might come is that the global transition and the transition to a low-carbon economy should be at the service of the society and the humankind, as well as the earth. It should not be done at the price of human rights, of child labor, or of society issues. I think it's really here where we need to be careful when we analyze the companies and when we look beyond the numbers, as Dan highlighted from the ESG ratings agencies, is to look behind the numbers and look at extra financials as fundamental data, not as alternative data, but to keep in mind that the material issues, they can be financials, they can be environmental, social, or governance, depending on the business model of the company and its place in the value chain of the products.
Thank you. And last comments from John.
Yeah, thank you. Sure, what's going to accelerate change? That's a big question. You know, maybe more crisis. It could be the one thing that galvanizes action. I mean, you know, certainly, you know, COVID, you know, I think forced us to recognize that we are bound to each other in many more ways than we sort of are prepared to sometimes accept. And so perhaps maybe further large-scale crisis of that nature might just sort of accelerate the urgency for nations to start collaborating. Certainly multilateralism as a way of working in the world is something that's at risk and under threat right now. And so, you know, I think greater levels of multilateralism are probably needed, a sense of collectivism, and I say that word guardedly, but it's kind of needed on some level if we're going to talk about large-scale change. You know, practically speaking, in the here and now around markets, you know, I'm having this debate recently with a colleague around the role of benchmarks. You know, what's the use? You know, if you look at, you know, the big pools of capital out there that are benchmarking themselves against the MSCI ACWI. You know, this is a benchmark that's leading us towards a 4-degree world. It's total insanity. You know, we're following a flag over a cliff, and the bulk of the world's liquid equity capital is following this thing as a measure of what's good. So perhaps maybe the one thing is a radical reshift and rethink on benchmarks, and I know that the world is kind of experimenting, and certainly a lot of agency indice providers are thinking about alternatives to the standard benchmarks. In terms of, I guess, accelerating capital towards solving for some of these kind of systemic risks, I believe that the biggest lever we have is on the opportunity side of the equation. You know, it's important to look at the risk, and yes, that motivates us to act, but focusing on where the opportunity exists, you know, which are the companies that are generating the bulk of their revenue from a good or a service that's aligned with a green economy outcome. How do we support those businesses to radically scale? You know, how do we get access to those businesses, both in the liquid and in the illiquid environment is necessary, both on the sort of debt and the equity side. I think, you know, focusing on the opportunity set is probably the one thing that may support sort of acceleration. And then I guess, you know, and this is me just speaking personally, I think at a personal level, each of us has to really think about, you know, and it's hard work. It's really hard work, but to think every day about where our money's going, the choices we're making. And yeah, it's a bit of a personal challenge, but it does actually on many levels start there. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And we wanted to leave some time for questions. I hope you'll have a question ready. And I'm not sure if we have microphones or if the microphones in front of you work.
The table work, you just push the button.
There's a button in front of you, so I think you can press that and that will activate your mics. Any questions from the audience? Please raise your hands. Do you have your hand up? Gentleman on the far left over here. And please also tell us who your question is is for, or if it's for all the speakers.
Does that work? Yeah, perfect. So thanks a lot. Absolutely great insight, and the way you look at it and try to transform it. The way I understand, you are all asset manager and provide services to clients. So when you implement your ideas into investment solutions, how, how is your daily life? How do you execute? How does the regulator either respond or your clients to your ideas? I would like to maybe get a little bit of touch and feel about your daily work.
Yeah, John.
Yeah, I'm happy to maybe kick off. Look, we are being the benefits of being a startup on some level, 2.5-year-old startup. We are 100% exclusively focused on building products, liquid and illiquid products that are delivering risk, return, and impact outcomes. And so on a daily basis, we're 100% focused on the incoming data into our world, the transformation of that data into a sensible signal, and the development of client products that deliver an appropriate risk-adjusted return. We spend probably 1 or 2 days a week looking at what's happening in the policy environment. We spend a great deal of time looking at the emergence of new data and unstructured data sets. And we probably spend a couple of days a month speaking to our clients, where we are both reporting to them on the current performance of their portfolios, but also we spend a great deal of time educating them and supporting them to think about how this topic is actually playing out in the broader parts of their portfolios. Given what we do, we often a very small part of a client's portfolio, and we often represent a small experimental part of their portfolio. So a lot of what we're trying to do is to say to our clients, look, let's partner with you. This is a long-term thematic. We've got data and insights that will help you get a better view on your portfolio. And so, on a 100% day-to-day basis, we are exclusively focused on risk, return, and impact outcomes, which is quite a shift from my old business where, probably to begin with, 100% of the assets were traditional, and over a decade, we probably got to 25% were focused on this, with the rest still very much kind of in the old world, so to speak. So it's quite a nice experience to be focused exclusively on this on a day-to-day basis.
Daniel, you mentioned Jay's FSRSN's been focused on sustainability for quite some time. So, same question to you, and perhaps how that's changed, perhaps over the last
Yeah, we
years.
have been in this field as a pioneer for over 3 decades, and for me, as head of sustainability, that has the advantage that we don't have to do some convincing internally, or we don't have a separate business line or something like that. So you find, to come to your question, also the ESG aspects in basically every single process already in place. And that's a bit the idea. So my team is maybe the competence center, but we see ourselves more as enablers of everybody else in compliance, in marketing, in sales, in product development. So if you look at our processes, there is always this sustainability aspect which is also covered. And portfolio managers, for instance, they get their risk report. They are supervised in the sense of liquidity and deviations from the prospectuses, but at the same time also in terms of alignment with the transition path for carbon we have committed to. And if they are too high, they get the red flag, right? And they have to correct. And that's a bit where I would like to go, actually. I would like to go to a place where we maybe don't even call it sustainability anymore. It's just there. It's business as usual, and everybody should do it. It's not my team doing it, and maybe then they can let me go because I'm not needed anymore, and they will say, what did this guy do anyway? That's where we want to be. It makes it also easier to talk to clients, because at a different place where I worked before, we had a sustainable business line for a while and a classic one. And it was funny to see what happens in front of clients, right? If you sell your sustainable product so convincingly because you think it's the right thing to do, the clients start asking, but what are you offering me in the other set of products, is this the bad stuff? Why do you want to sell that to me? You just made your point that I should invest sustainably, and that was the moment, of course, also for that organization to fully commit to sustainable investments. And that's where we, I think, are also in the market, that more and more organizations want to get there, where we already are, where everything pays attention in all aspects and processes to the sustainability perspective.
Sarah, did you want to comment as well?
Yeah. So, Mirabeau, we are a family-owned company for over 200 years that has been underpinned by the values of sustainability. So to survive 200 years with all the shifted and challenges that have happened, you had to be, and you have to be sustainable to get there. From the formalization of our approach for the asset management business line, we've been reinforcing our practices to have the clear purpose and the actionable agenda for the sustainability that is afterwards really deployed throughout our asset classes and tailored to embrace the specificities of each investment class or product. What echoes to me is that we are really having this vision so that the companies were really embracing the sustainability, so it integrated in the investment decisions, in the discussions every day. We work hand in hand with the investment managers, with the analysts and other teams, so that sustainability is the new normal, and the products take into consideration the sustainable criteria from the design of the product to the investment decision to the follow-up with the companies to the reporting, with this clear idea that we do what we say and we say what we do. We take into consideration the client's preferences, but while acting with conviction and independence and being accountable for the generations to come.
Thank you. And any other questions? Yes, gentleman in the grey t-shirt.
So it's very interesting to hear your questions and your doubts. I'm exactly from the opposite side of the table, which actually having exactly the same questions. You were asking yourself on how to reach out to projects. I come from Latin America. We have, for example, we are project developers, and my question is, how do we reach out to your side of the table to see, well, how we can offer our products and what's the best way make our projects reach to your ear?
Who'd like to take that question?
I'm happy to make a contribution. Look, organizationally, we've been quite proactive in terms of working with academic institutes. We've got some academics, ex-academics in our business. We've got a few PhDs, as I'm sure my colleagues do as well. We're always interested in engaging with entities that are thinking and producing evidence-based research. Yesterday I heard a fantastic presentation from the University of Dansk looking at sort of macroeconomic thematics and how that potentially evidences the transition towards the green economy and its alignment with capital flows into ETFs. A novel piece of research. Events like this create great platforms for us to access it. We also, I guess, pay a lot of attention to the academic forums that exist around many of these conferences. The UNPRI has got a fantastic academic platform. It's a good place to showcase research. There was a fantastic event at the University of Zurich recently. I guess, be happy to chat with you afterwards, but please, the academic industry academic world is a super important participant in enabling the kind of acceleration we're talking about.
And gentleman in the second row.
Thank you very much for your presentations. You each mentioned about the value of using data, using evidence, and I'm sure your institutions have strong procedures to ensure this. But do you think that data is a double-edged sword? It can also be biased. Do you think the industry or your institutions are doing enough to ensure that the data is of high quality? Is it a risk that people might play with this data. I would like to hear a bit more about how you ensure that the data you use is strong enough, reliable enough. Thank you.
Daniel?
I can comment, yes, it's not easy indeed, and we all know that data from different sources, even if they have the same label to it, they don't even measure the same thing, so there's huge deviations. The correlation between ratings is something 0.4, 0.5. So my hope is that in this regulatory initiative we see right now that we come to a point where ESG data is maybe as reliable as financial data. That's, in my view, as far as regulation should go, to create comparability and transparency so that we hear about gender, about climate, about water. We at least know that the data point from different providers and from different companies which report on those are comparable and are measuring the same thing. I don't necessarily think regulation should go further than that. I don't necessarily like regulation if they start telling us how to interpret the data. We would also not accept that on the financial side, right? We like having accounting standards globally, but as investors, we want to draw our own conclusions if we want to take more risk or if we want a growth strategy or a value strategy. And I hope the regulator doesn't overshoot and leaves it at a point where the data becomes more reliable, more transparent, more comparable, but leaves it open to us and the end clients to reflect their preferences in what they do with the data.
Sarah, go ahead.
For the data issue, we also believe that what's key is to go beyond just the numbers and to take the aggregate analysis and go beyond to define what is important for each investor, what are the data points that we want to look at, and to analyze in the most relevant way, depending on the asset class, on the capitalization of the company, of the geography, as the maturity is not the same, and the expectations that we might have, depending on the maturity of the market, might change. The second part is also to think outside the box, to look at alternative data and less traditional sources of data, such as leverage the power of big data, machine learning, also alternatives such as the GIS or sentiment analysis, and to combine this, consolidate internally in order to inform the investment decision based on our preferences and our convictions.
Well, it's 10:28, so we have 2 minutes for a last question. I'll take the lady on the front row.
Yes, I have a more general question for assets manager active in sustainability. Do you think that all the legal framework and disclosure requirement have fundamentally changed your decision-making process?
Tough question.
So, question on legal frameworks?
Yeah, in fact,
terms of our decision-making.
Do you think it has totally changed and fundamentally changed the way you work, your decision-making process? Is it a real influence on your decision?
Sure, interesting. I mean, it exists on kind of a number of different levels. I mean, it definitely changes the decision-making at a client level, the kinds of decisions that clients have to make. Certainly, when we look at companies, if there are changing regulatory issues or legal frameworks that impact, the commercial prospects for a business, absolutely, those are relevant and important considerations for us. But if I think about our organization specifically, we are single-mindedly focused on the pursuit of a risk-adjusted impact outcome, and so we are interested in the long-run, transition of the economy towards low-carbon, resource-efficient, socially inclusive, and so we consider as many relative, respective data points as possible to help guide us to that part of the market which is leading that transition. So, yeah, I guess in simple response is yes. But on an actual personal day-to-day basis, is it changing the way You know, am I making different decisions today as I did yesterday? Probably not.
Yeah. Yeah.
There are a few other questions in the room, but perhaps I can suggest you find the speakers afterwards to ask those. And I'd like to thank Daniel, Sarah, and John for today's really interesting discussion. I hope you all agree, and let's give them a round of applause. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. We are now going to a 30-minute coffee break in the village, and the next session recommences at 11 a.m. You can check the BB Connect app to see the full schedule and pick up your next session. Thank you very much.